You're very welcome to the Quinlan Family Lecture on Poetry. This is a great night in the Ireland House calendar of events. I'm extremely fortunate to have been involved in the sequence of exchanges and conversations that enabled this to happen, mostly because of the fact that I'm lucky in my friendships, and I'm lucky in the people who have come in the door to this great place and come in the door to Ireland House. Most especially in members of the Quinlan family who are teachers and lovers of poetry and who have enabled others throughout Tom Quinlan's long career as a teacher and through the Quinlan family's support of Glucksman Ireland House and of the Irish Studies program here. There are a number of people I do want to make a point of thanking and welcoming before I introduce anyone else. First, this event is offered in conjunction with the Irish Art Centre Poetry Festival, and that's become an absolutely signal event in the literary calendar of New York. Every autumn we can look forward to an extraordinary sequence of events bringing new and established poets from Ireland to New York to read their work and to put them in dialogue with leading voices in poetry, principally from America, but really to create a conversation about poetry and about poems, actually, not just about poetry in the abstract, but about particular poems. That's all come about through the leadership and guidance of Aidan, who I don't see in the door yet, but and also Rachel Gilkey at the Irish Art Centre. And we're really grateful, Rachel, for all the work that you've done in establishing this connection. But the Irish Art Centre Poetry Festival is curated by two really remarkable Irish individuals who made New York their home and made a mark in New York, and that's the celebrated and award-winning novelist Belinda McKeon, whose first novel, Solace, should be on your shelf. If it's not, I don't know what to say to you, except get it and read it and listen to it and understand it. Belinda's now finished a second novel. I don't know. Soon? I don't know. I don't want to ask. It's done. I know it's done. It's in the hands of the people who will bring it to the world after Belinda has written it. Belinda teaches now at Rutgers, but she's taught at Columbia, Princeton. When she's a guest at NYU, we're so grateful, and she's come into my classes, and she's a writer of short fiction and of novels and plays and journalism, and she's a terrific force, and she happens to also be partnered with Angus Woods, who is a philosopher and a poetry critic and a writer of range and talent and brilliance. So Belinda and Angus, thank you for all you've done to make the Irish Art Centre Poetry Festival what it is, which is, as I say, an extraordinary moment. And as the Center for Irish Studies here at New York University, it's wonderful when an institution like the Irish Art Centre, that's about bringing living culture, living artists into New York and fostering it, when we can make a harmonic rhythm happen between our academic and intellectual pursuits and the Art Center, the Irish Art Centre's mission. I'm extremely grateful to Anne Solari for her facilitation of this connection, as well as Cassandra Coast and Jamie Sweeney, who are also been absolutely instrumental in making tonight the event that I can see it will be. So thank you certainly for being here. I also want to welcome members of the Bergin family. I understand that Tara Bergin, whom I'll be introducing in a short while after we hear from a few other people, has met some new friends and old relatives, as it were. So that's a terrific experience that Ireland House can foster when people coming from Ireland can meet their American cousins whom they haven't had a chance to meet yet. And so you're very welcome here in the house tonight, and I hope, and we've seen you before, and we hope to see you certainly again. The Quinlan Family Lecture is offered in conjunction with the Seamus Heaney Prize for Poetry, which is awarded by Queen's University Belfast and the Seamus Heaney Centre for Poetry. The serendipitous connection between Glucksman Ireland House, the Quinlan family, and Queen's University Belfast happened when the funding for the Heaney Prize was zeroed out in a blunder of monumental governmental failure. And when we found that there was possibly a role to play for an American supporter of poetry, and particularly a lover of Seamus Heaney, and of course, lovers of Seamus are legion. It was perfect that it rhymed in the way that it did, and it enabled it to happen. And when the announcement of the endowment of the lecture was made several years ago, Seamus made the trip to New York, came here to the house, and renewed his connection, because he had helped to cut the ribbon with teacher Albert Reynolds when Ireland House was established in 1993. That enabled a wonderful conversation that happened with Seamus in the time before he left us too early. And this connection, this lecture, this poetry reading are testament to what he insisted upon in all of his life and all of his work, which is the importance of poetry for life itself, for who we are as people and as members of a community. And Seamus was especially delighted that the Quinlan Family Lecture Endowment stepped in to help recognize the Heaney Prize for Poetry, because the Heaney Prize for Poetry is offered to the first book of poems published in Britain and Ireland in a given year. And Seamus was quite eloquent and quite emotionally engaged with the idea of how important it is that a poet's first volume get heard and get read and get circulated, and that the poet who has found their way into print and into a volume for the first time finds an audience. And so that's an extremely important, it was extremely important to Seamus, it's extremely important, I think, to us and to keeping this connection between NYU, Glucksman Ireland House, Queen's University Belfast, the Seamus Heaney Poetry Centre moving forward. And so it's appropriate then for me to ask a member of the Quinlan family to say a few words about that relationship, and to maybe bring one of the Quinlans up to speak as well. So, Joe Quinlan. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's really great for this extended Quinlan clan here to be back in the house tonight. Mayor Lou and I live in walking distance, but my nephew Mike, he took the subway. My niece Amy drove in from her job in New Jersey, drove. And my sister Ginny is just back off the plane from an extended trip to Austria. And all of us coming from different ways to be here tonight. One person not here tonight, my mom, Virginia, is not really well enough to travel from Philadelphia. But if she were here, she would want you to know that she's the only one of us who's actually born here in New York. And I'm very proud of it, just across the river in her native Brooklyn. Accompanying my dad tonight also is an old dear family friend who has shared my father's teaching profession for most of the last 5 decades. That's John Hitler. All of us were here, though, for that wonderful afternoon back in September, 3 short years ago, when this lectureship was announced and celebrated. And we have really vibrant memories, I think, of Seamus, who was seated right there next to Loretta, giving what was really a surprise speech that spoke to the value of teaching literature, specifically poetry, and how important the Heaney Prize was to him. My father had actually met Seamus numerous times in the past 20 years, mostly on his nearly annual visits to the Yates Summer School in August. In fact, this book, this is Seamus's famous first book when he was a high school teacher, actually. Is from signed for me by my father. Got the autograph from August of '97, in fact, which I think was the first trip. A little side note, by the way. I took my dad for his 75th birthday, a very memorable trip. He wanted to go to the winter reunion of the Yates Summer School in the last weekend in January. And I want to tell you, the weather that January weekend was a lot like we had here in New York today. Very Irish. I accompanied him on numerous times back to Sligo, And the weather in August is exactly the same, by the way. So, I've yet to see, in 10 trips to Sligo, I've yet to see the sun, by the way. So, but it's still a great event every August. And that's actually where my father met Seamus and any number of the other Irish and Northern Irish poets that he came to know so well over there. There were a number of side benefits, though, to these trips. The biggest of which was uncovering and confirming our family's roots in nearby Fermanagh, where my father's grandmother, Cecilia Cox, had been raised before emigrating to Philadelphia in the 19th century. Cecilia was one of 8 children, and she herself was a mother of 8, including my oldest, including her oldest, which was my grandfather, John. I use the word carefully when I say there was almost a sacred moment when our cousins, whom we met, showed my dad and I the farm and the actual building where Cecilia had been born in 1862. You can only imagine the sacrifices that she made, and I could think that she'd be proud of tonight's event. Not surprisingly, our cousins from Fermanagh there are very good students, like my father, and more than one of them moved to the big city and studied, it turns out, at Queen's University, Belfast. And for me, at least, it makes the partnership with Queen's and the Heaney Centre even more appropriate and very special. And we're thrilled to meet our award winner tonight and welcome her here this evening. But first, it's a little bit of a tradition here. This is our 3rd year of this event. I think most of you know that my dad taught for some, if you read the book, let's see, some 66 years. The first 43 of which were in the Philadelphia public schools. It would have been longer if World War II and his service in it had not delayed his start by 3 years. What you don't know, and neither do I for that matter, is what short poem Tom Quinlan will read when he takes the mic here in a minute. The one thing I do know is he will have thought about it deeply, and he will read it with great conviction. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce you to the best teacher I know, Tom Quinlan.
Thanks. I'm going to test my voice first to find out if you can hear me without the microphone. Not the people in the front, you always hear. Can you hear me in the back? All right. Over here? Can you hear? Okay, I'm not going to use the mic. I'm going to read a poem by Seamus Heaney. I'm going to talk about it a little bit, because that's what teachers do. Usually, a few words of preface the poem takes about 2 minutes. The introduction takes about a half an hour. It's really unfair, I think, sometimes to ask you to listen to someone read a poem if you don't have a copy of it. You really everyone should have brought a copy with you. I checked at the door for the first 10 people, and I quit, because not only did they not bring the poem, they didn't know what it's called, a personal helicon. And the first guy said to me, "What the hell is a helicon?" He said it was a helicopter, I guess. I don't know. For the 1 or 2 people who don't know what a helicon is, there are now 3 of them. I didn't know either. You look in this dictionary. Helicon is a mountain in Greece. It's a magic mountain. It's dedicated to Apollo. And people have been going up this mountain for thousands of years to seek wisdom and to work out some artistic effect. Writers climb this mountain. It's there today. Dancers, singers, because on top of the mountain, through the years, there are supposed to be 9 muses. And people, like Seamus Heaney, climbed this mountain, as a matter of fact. And some of them go up and they perform, and they, on top of them, Narcissus was up there. There's a well up there, and you know the story of Narcissus. So this is a place, a helicon is a place where you seek wisdom and joy and happiness and salvation, I guess. And his personal helicon happened to him when he was a little boy. In Ireland, a long time ago, in Ireland and all over the world for centuries, there were actually two worlds. One was the world of kids, and one was the world of adults. And kids and adults never mixed, and he didn't mix in his family. He had, the last thing they told him, that personal helicon, something only a kid could handle, is looking at used wells in farms. They smell, they're dirty, and they have rats in them, and that's the kind of things that kids like. Their parents, and the first thing they tell them, first line of the poem, as a child, they could not keep me from wells. As soon as your mother says, stay away from the well, you can't wait to get out, and you go over. And this is a story of him seeking some kind of salvation, looking at these various wells. It's a magnificent poem. And he goes on and on and on in the poem and describes each one as he sees it. And finally, he gets to the end. He's a grown man, and he thinks back, and the question comes up, why would a man write a poem about crummy wells? And at the last line of the poem, I'm going to give you that first. You ready? You better be ready. Why do I do it? I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. Doesn't get any better than that. That's why he wrote the poem. Now I'm going to read it. Personal helicon. As a child, they could not keep me from wells and old pumps with buckets and windlasses. I love the dark drop, the trapped sky, the smells, and waterweed, fungus, dank moss. As an adult, it's enough to make you vomit, isn't it? But this is a kid, and that's the way they operate. And now he describes each well. One, in a brickyard with a rotted board top, I savored the rich crash where a bucket plummeted down at the end of the rope, so deep you saw no reflection in it. A shallow one, under a dry stone ditch, fructified like any aquarium. When you dragged out a long roost from the soft mush, a white face hovered over the bottom. It was his face, reflection. Others had echoes, gave back your own call with a clean new music in it. And one was scarce, for there, out in the ferns, tall foxgloves, a rat slapped across my reflection. This was his helicon, because he was a kid. And now, 50 years go by, and he writes the last few lines, wondering, what happened to me? And what happens to you? And what happens to all of us? We grow up. We grow up. Now, to pry into roots, to finger slime, to stare big-eyed narcissus into some spring. This is beneath all adult dignity. Isn't that sad? Beyond all adult dignity. And he analyzes, why do I do it? I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. Amen.
I don't like following that. I really don't. I don't like being here at this moment. So Sitting with Tom 3 years ago downstairs with Seamus Heaney, I reminded Seamus of the first time that I met him in 1985 in Dublin, and I asked him to sign the copy that my sister had given me before I went off to school in Ireland of Seamus' first volume, a beautiful little Faber copy, actually the first one. And I opened the book and asked him to sign, and I didn't have him sign on the first page. I asked him to sign on the last page at the end of the book. And I remember literally feeling, he grabbed my arm and said, "Thank you, that's my favorite. That's my favorite poem in the book." So serendipitous in a sense, that's it. And we talked about that with Tom actually when Seamus was downstairs with Mari Heaney a few years ago. The winner of the 2014 Seamus Heaney Prize for Poetry is Tara Bergin, native of Dublin, current resident of England, author of This Is Yarrow, published by Carcanet Press. This is a very rich and very complex terrain of poems that Tara has woven in the fabric of her first published book. Thematically, there are a range of themes that you'll hear in the poems that she'll read after she speaks and delivers a Quinlan Lecture before she reads her poems. There are poems of waywardness, of indirection, parent-child relationships, academic labor, reflections on violence and those trained for violence, the hard work of meaning found or of meaning almost found in her poems. They're poems that evince a continuing engagement of people from the western fringe of the islands of Europe with Eastern European literature and Eastern European culture. And in that sense, they renew a very important investment of Seamus Heaney himself, but also of Ted Hughes, about whom whose interest in Eastern European literature was the subject of Tara Bergin's PhD thesis. These are poems about traditions that are shyly or slyly engaged, indirectly engaged. They're poems that work within themselves to accomplish a recalibration of thought. So as you hear Tara's poetry, you have to be sensitive to the way in which she asks and then re-asks a question about thinking, a question about how to respond to words. We don't know, they often insist. You'll hear them say, I don't know, we don't know. Even as they point the way toward knowing, or toward one way of knowing. They're poems whose voices are tuned and are turned by vulnerability. And that's an exquisitely difficult thing to do. It's a really exquisitely hard thing to have a voice in a poem that is vulnerable, that understands itself as being open to the world, but vulnerable at the very same time. I think these are poems about the awkward and perilous but essential gulf between genders. Another form of vulnerability. They give us, in remarkable ways, a grammar, an occasional glimpse into the grammar of the uncanny. There has been this feeling, they say. There has been this feeling. They're poems, and this is an incomplete list, they're poems of tremulous energy, observant strangeness, observing strangeness, strange observers, troubled witness, and also folk weirdness. And that is deeply connected to so much of Irish literature and of Irish culture, but not pegged to a cultural specificity, but really to a human awareness of the strangeness of the world, the strangeness of our stories, the strangeness of our poems. Most of all, these are poems of humor and of honesty. So please join me in welcoming Tara Bergin and listen to her carefully.
I'm leaving that hat there for a reason, so don't worry. Thank you very much indeed. That was a fantastic introduction, which I won't be able to live up to. So I'm delighted to see you all here. I've never spoken to two rooms at the same time. This is great. I'm going to read a lecture which I think takes about 15 minutes, and then I've got 10 poems that I'm going to read. Now, they're not that long. Some of them are quite short, so don't panic. So I'll start with the lecture, which I've called Ireland as a State of Mind. Well, I'm very pleased and honoured to be standing here as a guest of Glucksman Ireland House and as a representative of the Seamus Heaney Centre for Poetry, which awarded me the prize that has facilitated this visit to New York. It's the first time I've been to New York, and it's extremely exciting for me. But most importantly, I'd like to thank the Quinland family, to whom I have already raised a glass in Belfast on the night of winning the prize, and to whom I will most certainly be raising several more glasses whenever I get the chance. So sláinte to Tom Quinlan and his family. I said I'd get one Irish word in, so I hope you understand that. I think you will. But I'm also pleased and honoured to be standing here as a representative of poetry itself. I say this as a sort of disclaimer, a way of letting you know that the lecture I deliver here tonight, I deliver not as an academic or a scholar or a historian, but as a poet. With this in mind, I would like to begin by reading from a piece of writing by Robert Graves, a carefully cut out photocopy of which I received in the post several years ago, sent to me by my father. My own affection for Graves goes back to a time when I had just begun my university studies of literature and was reading The White Goddess. To my surprise, in the first pages of the introduction, Graves confirmed for me a fact that up till then I'd assumed was merely known and discussed by my immediate family, namely that a man named Amergin, which in English is Bergin, was the first true poet of Europe. So excited was I by this confirmation that I took the book to my English professor the very next morning with the suggestion that he should not be starting his lectures with the Canterbury Tales or the Odyssey, but instead with the Song of Amergin, the poem which I had been hearing since I was a baby, and a translation of which Graves includes in his introduction to The White Goddess. Needless to say, my outburst made little impact on my professor's teaching schedule, as far as I know. But now that I've confessed this very embarrassing incident to you, I can go ahead and read the following passage, which is taken not from The White Goddess, but from Graves's The Case for Xanthopy. And it goes like this. I am no outlaw by temperament. I simply suffer from a poetic obsession which an increasing number of reasonable people share with me. Poetry for us means not merely poems, but a peculiar attitude to life. Though philosophers like to define poetry as a rational fancy, for us it is a practical, humorous, reasonable way of being ourselves, of never acquiescing in a fraud, of never accepting the second rate in poetry, painting, music, love, friends, of safeguarding our poetic institutions against the encroachments of mechanized, insensate, inhumane, abstract rationality. It's a powerful and rousing statement, and one which, although written in 1960, still carries great significance, I think. It's the kind of maxim that, for me, serves to clarify my own position in the world, where, like many writers, I often feel slightly out of place. My father must have recognized this, and having received it as I did, folded into an envelope with the citation carefully written in his hand beneath it, I've come to regard it as a kind of private coat of arms, a statement of belief for those of us whose beliefs are altogether too bound up with what we work at, day in, day out, to be readily compressed and spoken of in any spontaneous or casual way. It's this respect for words and what Patrick Kavanagh calls the gifts of the mind that represents Ireland for me. Because Ireland for me is, like for many of us here, my father and his father. Both are better men than I will ever be, as it were, but I learned from them, if nothing else, the importance of seeking out at all times the correct words for the subject at hand, to seek the most accurate and most honourable means of expression possible at the time. I choose for the title of this lecture, Ireland as a State of Mind, while thinking of Seamus Heaney's lecture, England's of the Mind, which he gave at Berkeley in 1976, and which I reread several times while writing my PhD thesis on the English poet Ted Hughes. Discussing the work of Hughes, Geoffrey Hill and Philip Larkin, Heaney describes their Englishness as deposits in the descending stories of the literary and historical past, and talks of a desire present in their language to perceive in the rituals of show Saturdays and race meetings and seaside outings, of church-going and marriages at Whitsun, and in the necessities that crave expression after the ritual of church-going has passed away, to perceive in these a continuity of communal ways and a confirmation of an identity which is threatened. As an Irish writer reading this, I ask myself, what of Ireland is my language signifying? What identity am I confirming? What old ways am I attempting to continue? I can think of some, but it's not done in a way that I thought or even hoped it would be. My own experiences in Loch Corrib and Loch Yarrow, fishing at night with my father, rowing the boat across a still lake, has left an indelible mark on my consciousness. But the mark wasn't pure. It couldn't be. I grew up in a capital city in the late 20th century, and the media and the flow of images and sounds coming into Ireland at that time was overwhelming. Of course, we were surrounded by a rich literary tradition. As teenagers, we studied Portrait of the Artist for the Leaving Cert. As students, we waited for the last bus outside Oscar Wilde's house in Merrion Square. As lovers, we sat at Kavanagh's leafy canals and walked Joyce's dirty streets along the Liffey. And when we waited to board our first Ryanair flight out of Dublin, we queued by billboards showing the famous faces and the famous quotes of these great Irish writers. But there was another side to our experience. One of the poems that I most remember from childhood is The Lake Isle of Innisfree. We were taught it as infants in school, and I can recall reciting it in classrooms in Dublin, meaninglessly chanting my way through it, until finally reaching the conclusion, I hear it in the deep heart's core. All monosyllables, all powerful. But I didn't know then quite how powerful it was, or why. Yes, I too listened carefully to the lake water and the sea water, but I was also listening carefully to English and American pop songs. I wanted Bob Dylan, Elvis, Johnny Cash, Madonna, Michael Jackson, Sid Vicious. I don't know how many of my classmates turned out to be poets. Somewhere along the way I did hear something in the deep heart's core, but it was, of course, in a different way to Yeats. As a result, my writing is by necessity impure, which is not to say corrupted, but it is hybrid, an amalgam, a memory, an experience, and a sound of home mixed with something else, something foreign, something slightly at odds with normality. You could argue that this is precisely the point, that departure is vital for any artist, the need to be outside of experience in order to shape it, and to not be overwhelmed by it. As an Irish woman, I'm keenly aware of independence. I'm suspicious of systems of power or being told how to behave. In addition to this, growing up in Dublin, where every street sign, every road sign, every announcement on the dart is in two languages, English and Irish, I gained a valuable plurality of experience. I suspect that all of this has had a great impact on me in the way my mind works, especially regarding my interest in poetry and translation, and in the idea that there are many alternative ways of saying what you mean. Well, tonight I wore a hat to Glucksman House, and I lay it here on this stage area as a symbol of Ireland, my Ireland, which is to say my father and my grandfather. And I think the members of my family that I just met today for the first time will know they're known for wearing hats such as these. But really, the fact that I place it here on a stage is particularly relevant because it suggests that the true home for someone like me, like us, is in a place as open and as without identity, or perhaps with the potential for multiple identities as a theatrical platform. It is, of course, also a place where words and the way that we choose to use them is of the utmost importance. Furthermore, the fact that I feel I can say this here in New York, as far away from Ireland as I've been to date, is proof that distance, while often painful, can also be necessary for true self-discovery and self-expression. As the Russian poet Marina Tsvetaeva wrote, "No one has yet understood how completely and how deeply faithless we are, which is to say, how true we are to ourselves." Thank you. Right, now the poems. This first poem is called Rapeseed, and I'm wondering whether, is it right that here you say you call it rape? The plants that grow, I'm not sure. Anyway, Rapeseed. He thought my clothes were my skin. He thought these soft things, this lace and these buttons, were things I belonged in, but I do not belong in them. I told him, but he didn't see. Look, he went on stroking my gloves and my things, thinking, what fine skin. Oh, Mr. My. I did take thee, and thou me. And after the ceremony, quiet. We drove past Rapeseed, fields of it through the window on the full, hot air. Oh sweet, oh stale, oh clinging to the air, oh shame, oh full, oh cruel. How we feared its fierceness, how we worried it would overlook us. We feared too much, thinking the world is reached only in violence. I think a lot of poets go to a lot of trouble arranging their manuscripts when they send them off to be finally put into book form, trying to decide which poem should go first and, the sequence of poems and things. Of course, not everybody reads a book of poems in sequence, and I've also noticed that rarely at a poetry reading will I ever read the poems in sequence, so I don't know why I bothered. But anyway, tonight I'm going to read, the next 4 poems I'm going to read happen to be all in a row, and we'll see how we get on. So this is the first poem in the book, and it's set at the opening of an art exhibition in a gallery. And it's called Looking at Lucy's Painting of the Thames at Low Tide Without Lucy Present. Water is terribly difficult to paint. And to drink also, don't you find? It's terribly difficult to drink water. In winter in particular. Lucy says we must drink 8 glasses a day, but the truth is I can't abide it. Lucy's face looks terribly bruised, do you find? Especially under artificial light. Is everything all right with Lucy, do you think? She seems quite abstracted most of the time. And artists will insist on painting water, despite its obvious difficulty, and above all, its secrecy. They say the marine world is notoriously close-knit. I detested, of course, the work. I simply can't stand the academic realism of the whole endeavour. That's not to say it isn't worth something. On the contrary. This is acting school. Tomorrow is the day of the main performance. I play, not by choice, a sprightly, foul-mouthed American. Generally, the cast is following the Strasbourg method. We never try to be jealous or stirred up for no reason at all. In today's rehearsal, we begin, as always, with articulation. Lips, trill, jaw, spring, palate, soft, tongue, pointing out from the mouth, and we are humming all the while, humming all the time, and all the time centering, rubbing the center, and rocking and aligning, pulling the string up from the crown and not the chin, looking out with the eyes and not the chin. And before speaking, before singing, all the time increasing our capacity for breath. The director has told us that exiting well is an art. It will prove no less vital to your life as an artist, he says, than entering. While a good entrance might be slightly more central, exiting well could be a turning point in your career. And now we must practice how to drink water when there is no water. Once Aoife ceases to argue about the fact that we have nothing in our mouths, we can get on with the task of learning. Swallowing air, as the director says, might not be the same as swallowing water, but for our purposes at least, there is a sufficient amount of physical truth in what we do. I like to think that that's a total parallel with writing poems. And then continuing with the theme, this is called Water is Difficult. Oxygen and hydrogen in a liquid state, convertible by heat into steam and by cold into ice. Mr. H. Fowler, Mr. F. Fowler, you do make things sound nice. In summary, water is a liquid consisting chiefly of this. Just one of these things, so the Fowlers say, is due to appetite. But I have a thirst, I have a fear, I have a sin of. And Lucy is on her knees before you, water, admitting that she might not believe. What does it do? What does it do, she asks, except leave? Tell her, before she herself decides to go. Things break, even water. Water must break if we are to enter and live. And this one, fourth in the row. I should explain that I mentioned that I did this PhD, but as a poet, it was a ridiculous thing to think that I could do. I mean, I did manage it eventually, but it was extremely torturous. I didn't find it easy at all to write, in a linear, sort of coherent way, and so everything had to be written about 1 million times before I got it right. So while I was doing this PhD, I, as a kind of release, I suppose, I would invent characters in my poems that rebelled against the whole thing. And so that was really quite good fun, but I could do that. And this is one of these poems, and it has an epigraph which just is, no negotiation before departure. And it's called All Fools' Day, an Academic Farewell. In this paper, I will make no direct reference to the above title, or expand on the possible relevance of my argument, symbolic or otherwise, to the main topic. I will go on to plagiarize several well-known poets and writers without citing their work or acknowledging their influence on my thoughts in any way. See, for example, the epigraph to this abstract, a quote which was taken from the leader of the opposition in Cairo, 2011, yet used here out of context in an entirely inappropriate setting. Finally, I will put to myself the same questions that my examiners, so I have been warned, will put to me. Each of my answers will be indirect, unsuitable, and ultimately unclear. I shall fail, in other words, to satisfy the criteria set by the examiners and their governing board. Don't ask who's keeping house. No one's keeping house today. That was a great poem to write. I felt much better. But part of my work, anyway, while I was doing this torturous study, was I was looking at translations. I was looking at, in particular, this poet, Ted Hughes, who it turns out was translated from a Hungarian poet who was writing after the Second World War. And yet Ted Hughes didn't speak Hungarian. So I had to, my whole thing was like, how can this work and what's going on? And so I did a lot of comparative studies. And I found this Hungarian poem that Hughes had translated, but he'd translated it from an English version that he'd read. Anyway, you don't need to know all that, except that the title of this poem happened to be called, had a long title, it was called The Boy Changed into a Stag Cries Out at the Gate of Secrets. And it was a very, very long poem in Hungarian that was written, I think, in the 1950s. It had all sorts of political undertones and all the rest of it. But anyway, I was doing my studies. I had to take a trip from the north of England down to London, and I was on a train doing my studies of this poem, which I was comparing different versions of it. And while I was on the journey, a stag party got onto the carriage. And so I was thinking of how I could write about this experience, and it turned out that that experience with my study of this poem all merged together. And I wrote a kind of my version of this. It's not as long as the Hungarian one. So this is it, and it's called Stag Boy. He enters the carriage with a roar. He clatters in wildly and fills up the carriages with heat, running through the train, staining the floor with hooves dirty from the street, tearing at the ceilings with his new branched horns, banging his rough sides against the seats and the women who try to look away, gallant. He sings hard from his throat, his young belling tearing at his chest, pushing at his boy throat, stag boy. The train's noise hums in his ears, sharp and high like crickets pulsing in the tall grass, and he wounds it with his horns, maddened like a stung bull, pushing up his head, pushing up his mouth for his mother's teat. Where is her bee stings? Where is the flowered mug she used to warm his milk in? No good. No good now. He's smashing out of the train door. He's banging his hooves in the industrial air. He's galloping through the city squares and drinking from a vandalized spring. And still his mother walks through the house crying, "Stag boy, oh stag boy, come home." A poet who I mentioned in my lecture, Russian poet Marina Tsvetaeva, she's another poet whose work in translation I did a lot of studies of. And quite a few of the poems in this book refer to those studies in one way or another. And at the back I've included some notes about one or two poems. And the poem I'm going to read next, there's a note about it here, so I thought I'd just read the note and then I'll read the poem. And the poem is called Studying the Fresco of St. Nikolai of Myra. And the note just says, in a book about the final days of Marina Tsvetaeva, Irma Kudrova tells the story of a 10-year-old boy who went into an empty church in Yelabuga to look at the frescoes. He saw a woman with cropped grey hair, squinting, examining the paintings on the walls, and studying the ones which showed St. Nikolai of Myra restraining the arm of an executioner who had raised his sword over the condemned. The boy said, "He will save them. They're not guilty of anything." "I know that," the woman answered. The woman was the great Russian poet Marina Tsvetaeva. This event took place only days before Tsvetaeva was found dead, having hanged herself. It is the shadow playing havoc with the blondness of your hair because it looks black. And Marina, on your black hair is a light from the window, making me sure you're wearing the Virgin's crown. Whatever you see, you know the dying are not guilty. Through the window the soldiers are marching and singing. They are singing, "It is your name day, Marina, Marina," and the church of the protection of the veil stands near your house. And there is singing in the church, even if there is no God. Just 3 more poems to go. This is military school. The analysis of battle begins here at our desks. The voice of violence enters our mouths and our skin, and under my own nails I hear it seduce me. I argue with nothing, it says. The voice is a swan of the estuary. It laments, it recites, 16 dead men, the rose tree, out of pages yellowed from 1953. It bangs, oh it bangs, a Bowron, I agree. I denounce my motherland, propose fidelity to my fatherland. It begins here. The voice of beauty begins here, lovely out of the desk. We mark our youth on the photocopied maps with black crosses. Obediently, we mark our youth. Now this next poem, Tom Quinlan mentioned this to me. He said it was one of the 3 he'd read out of the book. And he had an interesting way of describing it, but the title is At the Garage. Ask me, have I fallen in love with the mechanic? Perhaps for a moment. He doesn't know what it is. It's his hands, so thickly black with engine oil, so hard working and in such high demand. Ask me, is there violence in the dirt? Perhaps for a moment. Like a criminal's thumb which gets held firmly by the prison officer and is then rolled hard onto gummed paper so that we know that he's done for and even the backs of the mechanic's hands, as well as the palms, are all inked black, and everything they touch will be evidence of him. The keys, the white receipt, my own hand or cheek were he to touch it. Ask me how that makes me feel. My cheeks turned pink with the thought of it, while his blushes, if he had blushed, would be hidden behind grease, a soft, deep dirt that is soft and thick, like the ink in tins that etchers use. It makes the whites of his eyes whiter and the blues bluer. Yes, perhaps I am almost in love with the mechanic, but it's terribly awkward face to face. It's terribly awkward to be in such close proximity to the mechanic and the dirty girl on the calendar, who is always there, just visible from the small window where I go afterwards to pay. And as I said, a friend of mine who's a writer, who should know better, she emailed me the other day and said, I have to take my car to the garage tomorrow, but sadly my mechanics aren't like your mechanics. So I replied and said, neither are mine. You know, I do use my imagination sometimes. Well, you've been a great audience, and this is the last poem I'm going to read, and it's the last poem in the book, and the title poem. And it's a love poem. This is Yarrow. In this country house, I had a dream of the city, as if the thick yarrow heads had told me, as if the chokered dove had told me, or the yellow elder seeds had made me ask. And in the dream, I went up to the dirty bus station, and I saw the black side of the power station, and as if the brown moths tapping at the window made me say it, I said, do you still love me? And when I woke and went to the window, your tender voice told me, this is Yarrow, this is Elder, this is the collared dove. Thank you very much for listening.
I told you it was good. We'll take a few questions. A moment. We have a few moments before we have to raise a glass.
Are the questions for Tara?
Yes, for Tara. Indeed,
John?
yes.
I don't mind if you don't have questions. I'd love to hear, this is probably a very annoying question, but you did complete your PhD on Ted Hughes, and I suppose that his influence on you as a poet must have been fairly strong, but was it something that you were very conscious of, or, could you talk a little bit about that? I'm sorry if that's really annoying to ask you about the influence of your PhD subject.
No, that's all right. I mean, sorry for turning it
Could you restate?
Oh, right. I'm sorry. Is it on now?
No, I don't know.
Okay, but if you could just restate.
I'll say it if you want, because it's just talking about the fact that I did a PhD on this poet Ted Hughes and whether that had influenced my writing, really. I was just going to say, never ask anyone about their PhD.
Yeah.
So I'm stuck here now for another hour, so I'll try not to go into it. But I never liked the idea of being influenced by a PhD subject, but I always know that if I ever read, in the back of the book that somebody's doing a PhD on Elizabeth Bishop or something, I'll go and reread the poem saying, I think it does sound a bit like Elizabeth Bishop actually. But I never consciously thought I was influenced by him, except the main thing I looked at in Hughes was his book Crow, which is one of his earliest publications and probably his most controversial, and that's the one I was really studying. And in a way, I was never even really sure whether I liked that book very much, and he certainly wouldn't be someone I would have said was my favourite poet or anything, but I know that when I read Crow for the first time, I remember thinking, Jesus, I didn't know you could do that in poetry. I didn't know you were allowed to do that. And that definitely had an influence on me. The energy of that book, again, whatever you think about the actual poems, there's I think an undeniable energy and really sort of boldness in it that gave me inspiration in a way that to go in a different direction. Almost, right, you can go in your own direction now. You don't have to go in anybody else's direction. So I'd say that would be the biggest influence. it working now?
I'll do my best. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, I love the availability of your language. I don't have to think too hard. I'm so willing to go along with the story. You tell me the story of Lucy and the problem with water, and do this and do that, but we know there's stories going on behind her. And you also tell us about going into that garage. And I love the fact that you saw his hands, and it was his hands that were going to make your life better. So what cares? It was just wonderful. So I really thank you so much for that.
I'm delighted. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I have a question about my apologies. My apologies if I continue to sound like a broken record, because I asked this at every poetry fest, and it's the question of rhyming poetry versus free verse. Which do you think is the more difficult? Somebody said one time when I raised the question that the reason I don't appreciate as much the free verse is that I forget the assonance involved. Now, I wasn't quite sure what assonance was until I looked it up, and it said that that's the internal rhyming of vowel sounds. And I thought I detected that all right in your rapeseed poem, and also the one at the garage. But could you perhaps elaborate on the free verse, the beauty of that too?
Well, I was asked that before. I was doing a poetry reading in the north of England, and a woman, in not as beautiful a way as you phrased it, she said, "What happened to rhyme?" Well, I think it is hard to write good rhyming poetry, and so often it can sound, I don't know, just it's hard to get it to work. But, you know, I do find it hard. I've got one or two that have real strong end rhymes in this, but not many. So I think it's a great thing if you can get good, strong rhymes. I hear a lot of assonance in my own writing, but I think that's just me. I do realise sometimes when I read them as well, I think these sound a bit more like stories, like short stories almost. But I know that when I work on a poem, I'm very aware of internal rhyme. But I think, interestingly enough, when you start to read in public, you get even more aware of how things sound. Even though I will read out loud to myself, but reading in front of people is very different. And I have noticed that I've started to really be even more conscious of sort of, what can you call it, not so much rhyme, but sort of the chiming of vowels and internal rhymes, so that when you're reading it, it's actually easier to read rhyming poetry than it is to read prosy poetry. You know, it's easier on the mouth kind of thing to read it out. So I wonder, is that something to do with it as well, the oral tradition of poetry being not so strong now, that's why maybe we don't rhyme.
It's easier to remember rhyming.
And it's much easier to remember, exactly. So it's probably is harder to write poetry that rhymes, that still retains its meaning, isn't that? I studied a lot of translation stuff, and of course when you're translating a poem that rhymes, you have, the battle is always, do you keep the meaning or do you keep the rhyme? Because often you can't keep both. So maybe it's a little bit like that even when you're writing from scratch.
Yeah, I just want to ask about something that came up in the Marina Sataiba poem at the end. They're singing in the church even if there is no God, which kind of chimes with Brecht's they will be singing in dark times, right? So I wonder about the question of poetry and belief. Is poetry itself a form of belief or transcendent belief for you?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think it's one of those things. I mean, how would you class a belief, or what are the characteristics of a belief? And one of them would be a sort of comfort. That's a really horrible word, actually. But you know, you can get comfort, can't you, from thinking of what your strongest beliefs are. And I think that when all else fails, that this is the place where I belong. you know, whatever the result is, the making of it is something that is right. And I think that a lot of writers will feel like that it's where they can go to pray. I mean, if you want to really, to put it strongly, yes. So, yes, that's that question.
Thank you.
I see no more hands raised, and I honestly don't know if we'll get a better question or a better answer than the last. So I have only two things that I'm going to ask of you, well, actually three. The first is join me in thanking Tara Bergin.